Street Fighter movie is a go. Traditional computer game makers falter. And Sega's battle with Nintendo heats up. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man.
What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, this show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. Today we're going to be turning the clock back 30 years to June of 1993. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex. Welcome back, Alex.
Thanks, Carl. Always good to be here.
It's always good to have you here. So, now, before we can actually get into any of the fun, informative stuff, we must do obligatory podcast banter. So, do you have anything new to share?
Well, of course, I'm continuing my own endeavors out in podcasting land. They create worlds, as always. And right now, my mind is definitely on All Dragon Con all the time, because not only will I be attending and volunteering, as I always do, but my co-host Jeffrey and I will be presenting a panel on video game history at the Dragon Con.
Yeah, and seventh guest, a very important title that you will be deep diving within your restricted 60 minutes of panel time.
That's right. If I had planned things better 30 years ago, I would have not played seventh guest so that I could do it for our 7 minutes in heaven today. But alas, I have encountered it before.
Yes, it was on the list, and that is a wonderful transition to our first proper segments. And let's be honest, nobody really cares about the whole small talk part that seems obligatory in every podcast. So
I love talking to you too, Carl.
We do that off the recording. Come on. If anybody does want to listen to that and wants to suggest that as a Patreon bonus, hey, throw it in there. Why not? Okay. But speaking of Patreon bonuses, if you are a member of the Patreon for just $1 a month, the same amount that Mike Pence is currently asking for so he can finally get his 40,000 votes to be on the debate stage. Sorry, just had to throw that in. That was too funny this week. If you do want to support the show and get one of the very cool bonuses, which is the video version of our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a magazine cover dated June of 1993. Remember, when we're using the dates of June 1993, we're always talking about cover dates of publications or magazines, so obviously everything happened a little bit before that. It's just framing device. Please don't send me emails. And we had many games to choose from. We had Seventh Guest, one of the great CD-ROM wonders of 1993. We had the German role-playing game Realms of Arcania. We had the French production Eternum. We had the very weird Hudson Amiga exclusive Yo-Jo, which in and of itself, just the creation history of that game and the entire Hudson Amiga endeavor is almost worth discussing in and of itself. But okay, you didn't choose that. We had arcade games like Arabian Nights. No, Arabian Nights is not the arcade game. It's the Amiga game that gets reviewed everywhere and then doesn't actually get released until last year. That's another story too.
Not to be confused with Arabian, the arcade game.
Yeah, that's true too. But around this time, there's also this really weird side-scrolling beat-em-up game set in the Arabian Nights type world, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's absolutely terrible. We had Mazen Saga, which was a Japanese game based on the Mazinger IP. And I mean, the one that I kind of hoped you were going to go for, which was Street Fighter II Champion Edition on the Genesis, pre-release of the 6-button controller, which would have been fun to watch you try to play. Super Turrican, absolutely brilliant port of the game, and so on and so forth. Lots of fun games, but you decided to go with, well, you didn't choose crap. I'm sorry, but you didn't choose crap.
No, we've done a bit of that recently. It felt like it was time for a change of pace.
Too bad. There was, Lethal Weapon for the Game Boy. Have you played that?
I have not.
Oh, there's a special place in hell for that game, and I was kind of hoping I'd put it on the list just for that purpose.
Now, in all fairness, if my flight stick weren't stuck in storage someplace, I may have gone for the Strike Commander. But I am not playing that kind of game without a flight stick. Not even for the amusement of you, the paying fans.
Oh, there's so many reasons to play that game, but yeah. You could have played F-15 Strike Eagle on the Super NES, which I had not played before this. I vaguely remembered an ad for it once, and when I actually did play it, it's an interesting experience. That one. But okay, we're going to be talking about related topics later in the show. So, what you did choose to play, or you will choose to play because you obviously haven't done it yet. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We don't do editing here. It's all just real time.
That's right.
What you've chosen to play, sir, is the NES Classic. So in the 16-bit age, there's still NES games showing up, and it's Kirby's Adventure.
That's right.
Are you ready?
Yeah, so, fun fact, I have never played a Kirby game. Kind of the real classic ones. I realize they still make them today, but the real classic originals were the Game Boy and the NES game that we're going to be doing right now. And, by 93, I wasn't buying games for my NES anymore. And I didn't actually own a Game Boy until 1998. So just kind of, even though I was very aware of Kirby, I was a Nintendo Power subscriber, he just wasn't present in my personal gaming life in that way. And so I never never got sucked in by the character.
Oh, jeez. Oh, that was number one, that was painful. And number two, the fact that you never went back to try to fill the gap. It's just so wrong. I mean, I didn't play it either at the time. I never owned an NES or a Game Boy. But when emulation hit, that was one of those titles that I had to sort of catch up on. It was on the short list of games that I needed to at least experience.
I did it all for the podcast, Carl. 20 years ago, I made a pact with myself that I would not play a Kirby game until I could do so on a podcast. And here we are.
This is how destinies are born, everybody. So, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Cool.
Who's Kirby? Behind the flabby facade, a physical powerhouse, a street fighter, a weapons expert. He's whatever the situation demands. In Kirby's Adventure, evil King Dedede's stolen Dreamland's dreams. Now Kirby's fighting to get them back, level by nightmarish level. That's Kirby. He's cute. Till you cross him, then he's one tough cream puff. Kirby's Adventure on NES.
Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Kirby's Adventure?
I would say that it is a classic platform game, kind of tweaked more towards the beginner side of things, or the less Twitch adept, with the added benefit of being able to eat everything in sight and then turn it against the enemies. Of course, the most famous mechanic being that certain enemies that you eat, when you devour them, you can actually gain their ability and use that against other enemies and obstacles in the game.
Interesting. So, now the game obviously is on an NES.
Yes.
So, does it suffer from in the visual department, or?
It really doesn't, and I think this comes down to just how awesome, quite frankly, the people at HAL Laboratory were. I mean, they had been working, it was a late era NES game, so by this time they'd been working with the NES for a fairly long time. They had great talent there, like Iwata and Sakurai, and they had a really good understanding, I think, of how you can and cannot use an NES. So, you have the occasional period of something disappearing or glitching on the edges of things, but it has a pretty good color palette, and they do a good job with their placement of enemies and objects so that you're not getting that constant flicker and slowdown that you would see in some NES games in this time period.
Yeah, and also an unbelievable use of the color palette.
Yes.
I mean, those how would you describe the color palette of the NES? It's more of a, I don't want to say beige or anything. But it's kind of muted color.
Yeah, exactly. Some pastels and some more washed out colors. You definitely don't get a vibrant color feel most of the time from the NES. There's some exceptions, but in general, even something like the original Super Mario Brothers, which is obviously very well done as a game, but it still has that very kind of washed out kind of palette.
Yeah. And they use it wonderfully for the outlines. I mean, they're not using a black outline for Kirby. They're using a pink outline or a darker pink and then a lighter pink inside the character. So it really creates a nice contrast, and it also helps distinguish, what's foreground, what's background, what you can jump on. Mm-hmm. It's just very, very pleasing on the eye.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I guess Stone Cold Classic, not much else to say there. Would you recommend the game to players approaching it today?
Absolutely. I think Kirby still holds up very well, and it's got some unique mechanics that are fun, revolving around the eating and using of special abilities. And especially if you're somebody that isn't as good at or hasn't had as much experience with these kind of run and jump platform games, it's a great way to ease yourself into that and kind of get a feel for what was one of the primary forms of video game gameplay in that time period, that NES, SNES, Genesis era.
Very cool. So now we know. And with that being said, let's move on to the next segment of our show, the one that we have to go to before we can turn on the time machine. Namely, we need to check in with our good friend Ethan for the Department of Corrections to find out what I got wrong in our May 1993 jump.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan, to the Department of Corrections.
Hi, Carl.
That sounded like
Alex is here too, huh? Oh, yeah. My.
I brought company.
Just standing there in the corner, pretending like he's gonna be unnoticed. Oh, Alex.
Mer.
So, okay. We're going to talk about May 1993.
Yes.
I suppose so.
Start us off, sir. What did we get wrong? And I'm including Alex now because he knows more about this than I do. So
we must first give a comment to Alex.
Oh.
Alex, I would like to hear your full rendition of My Way. Sometime. Not now, but eventually.
I do not want to get hit on. I do not want to get a copyright hit. Okay. So
he does a perfect
let's...
Frank Sinatra. I'll have you know.
Oh, really? You've been holding out
absolutely
on
pitch perfect.
Okay, I know what the Patreon add-on for this month's gonna be. Yay!
There we go. Okay, now we got two things to talk about for May of 1993. Carl, submit yourself to the corrections.
Let me have it.
First off, there is something regarding the Deep Space Nine license with Star Trek. And in fact, two different publishers actually did Deep Space Nine games in 1995, both Viacom and Playmates. It's an interesting fact that it appears, I haven't done a systematic breakdown of this, but it appears that the Star Trek license has never been exclusive in games to a single publisher. I think that's true. Because it's always bouncing around to these different publishers. Like Viacom, they have the rights, but a lot of different publishers have touched the Star Trek license.
Did Playmates have the toy license at that time? Because there were action figures at that time. That may be why, similar to how with Star Wars, like Parker Brothers already had the home rights. Kenner Parker did through the action figure thing.
Yeah, Playmates had already launched the Next Generation toys at that point, and then they expand to the other ones. Obviously, not obviously, but Interplay had the original series license for computer games up until 2000, starting with the 25th anniversary games. And it's broken up all over the place. I know Simon & Schuster had the computer license exclusively for a long time.
Well, that's because they were part. They were
part
owned
of
by Gulf and Western, which
exactly. Yeah.
I guess it changed its name to Paramount by then. And that's also the reason Sega did the arcade game back in '83. So
that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I knew about the connection with Gulf and Western, and for some reason it did not click on with me. Yeah, of course, Sega was also Gulf and Western.
Yeah, I believe it changed. They changed their name to Paramount in the late '80s, but don't hold me to that. I didn't actually look that up.
Whatever it is, there were two Deep Space Nine games.
Yeah, well, there's the Fallen, but doesn't the Fallen come a little bit later?
I looked at them both, and they said 1995. I just
no. Wait, you're thinking it's Harbinger. A Harbinger is 1995, as well as the Super Nintendo and Genesis games. And then the Fallen comes a little bit later, and I can't remember. That may have actually been Activision who did that one, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So,
well, Carl will give you all
they were all pretty bad.
The straight skinny. One day we'll do an episode on Star Trek games special, but for now we'll leave that as it is. And one last correction for May 1993: it is the death and return of Superman.
Yes.
Yes.
Not just the death of Superman.
And it was Simon & Schuster that did the Fallen. Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Yes, that's true. By the time of the game, the cat was out of the bag that he was coming back.
I mean, it was obvious from the beginning, let's face it.
It was obvious to comic book readers from the beginning, but the naive general public, I think, for a moment really thought they were killing off Superman. They didn't understand how this works.
This is true.
The cultural moment.
Was that before or after they killed off Robin?
That was after. That was after. Yeah. Robin was in the late 80s, I think. And in all fairness, they really did kill off Robin for a while. I mean, even longer than like Superman, who they were always bringing back. I mean, Red Hood didn't show up right away, I don't think. After.
Oh, no. Red Hood doesn't show up for years.
Sorry, not Red Hood. Not Red Hood. Red.
Yeah, whatever.
looking for.
All right, we're going off on a comics tangent now.
Okay,
But
let's
the
get back.
Department of Corrections for May 1993 has concluded. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
We're done already?
Yeah, because Alex was here, so he was able to keep you on the straight and narrow. We'll conclude there, and we'll see you next time for June 1983.
As always, Ethan, thank you for your service. And remember, everybody, link down below in the show notes to Ethan's awesome work. He's been putting in a lot of cool hours on his material. Ethan, plug away.
Do I have anything to plug? I haven't, not recently.
Well, it doesn't have to be recent. It's out there for people to watch. So it's
the history of how we played.wordpress.com at gameresearch_e or at playhistory at the various places. I do threads. I do stuff about research. I sometimes whine and complain, but not too much. I try to keep it strictly focused on the games. Reach out to me. I'd love to talk about any game history subject.
Perfect. Okay, then. See you next time.
Peace.
You got off with pretty light punishment there. I'm not even sure they made you stay overnight in the drunk tank this time.
No. I mean, hell, I got out of there without having even being strip searched. I mean, that was a really, really light one. That was good.
Wow.
So. This is why I got to keep you around. This makes the whole Department of Correction thing so much easier. Okay. Well, with that being said, it's time to turn on the time machine and head back to June of 1993.
Kid to point a gun at a television set.
Welcome back to June of 1993. Alex, what's our first story?
Well, Carl, it appears that Capcom's set to co-finance Street Fighter movie. Oh, and Street Fighter 3 to come in the fall.
Pressman Productions has partnered with Capcom to make a movie based on Street Fighter II. Seeing as Pressman has made the Academy Award-winning Reversal of Fortune, this will no doubt be a classy affair. Oh, and Capcom announced for, I don't know, maybe the 5th times in the last 2 years that Street Fighter 3 will finally arrive in the fall, so, hey!
Now, I know why your sarcasm is in there. I understand why you've basically got classy in air quotes there. I gotta say 2 things. First of all, I do like the Street Fighter 2 movie for what it is, which is a horrible cheese fest. I mean, let's be clear about that. But
you're preaching to the choir here, dude.
Okay,
you are
good.
Preaching to the choir. I am a unabashed fan of the Raul Julia movie due to the simple fact that they went out of their way to basically make the biggest cheese fest since Adam West Batman.
Absolutely. And it works. It works much better than, say, the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, which tried to go the cheese fest route, the cheesiest since the Adam West Batman with the same character, and didn't work at all. But the other thing I will say is that I am so sorry that had to be Mr. Raul Julia's final movie, because even he was great, and it's amazing how much he put into it while he was literally dying while he was making it. But that shouldn't be the last thing that someone of that stature does. That
is sadly true. Then again, there's a lot of people who've made bad last movies, or movies at least that were not up to their standards. Let's face it, Transformers the movie should not have been the end of what's his name?
Orson Welles.
Yeah.
I am hungry and I have run out of frozen peas. I require planets, more planets to feed my insatiable hunger.
Fudgesicles. It was all about the fudgesicles in his final years. Or John Candy, Wagons West.
East.
Wagons East, that's what it was. Yeah.
I've not seen that one, but I've not seen it for a reason.
All I saw was the trailer. That was enough. Did not need to go any further.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, no, I mean, certainly it's a better final movie for Raoul than some of that. Though I will always stand for the Transformers movie as well. And again, I understand that half of it is just nonsensically plotted, and but it's fine. I liked it. I was not traumatized by it, like so many were.
Yeah, no. You mean the Transformers movie or Street Fighter?
Yes, Transformers movie. No, the Street Fighter movie, I mean, didn't traumatize anybody. Like, the Transformers movie, that traumatized some children.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
Like, legit. Not just, oh, this is terrible, but I'm crying because everybody's dying and there is no God, and why?
Oh, don't worry, little Jimmy. He's coming back in a couple of months anyway on the TV. It's okay.
I mean, he comes back.
Yeah, that's
Prowler.
True. That's true.
Prowler and Ironhide and all of them don't come back. And let's not forget that the first time Optimus Prime comes back, he comes back as a zombie. And then they kill him off again. And then they finally brought him back for real. And then, like, soon after that, the show was over. But, can't.
Yeah.
But, well, that was a tangent.
Yeah. As somebody who read the comics, I saw them take off his head. So, I saw him talking to, passing on the Matrix while he was just a disembodied head. So that was kind of, I was used to the trauma of him dying. Then when he dies because he killed some creatures in a video game, that was a really great moment too. Sorry, if you haven't read the Marvel comic of the 80s, there's some great stuff in there, and there's also some really weird, stupid stuff. But okay.
But we should probably get back to Street Fighter 2, because we have more Street Fighter 2 coming as Capcom announces Street Fighter 2 Turbo for Super Famicom.
With Champion Edition not yet out in the US for the Genesis, Capcom has announced that the Japanese Super Famicom will be getting the next iteration of Street Fighter II, Turbo, and has shown off Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the PC Engine at the Consumer Soft Group trade show in Japan. Surely this will be the end of these updates, right?
Yes. Yes, there will never be any more Street Fighter 2s, ever.
Exactly.
Street Fighter 3 is coming in the fall. We don't need more Street Fighter 2s.
No, of course not. So, this one caught me by surprise just from the timing, because as we mentioned before, Street Fighter Champion Edition does get reviewed in a couple of magazines already this month for the Genesis, even though the 6-button controller's not out yet. So it's got that weird, hit start button to switch the buttons around thing going on. But Sega must have been pissed that this is hitting the magazines and it not some side magazine, it's Electronic Gaming Monthly. So anybody who was like, oh, I gotta buy a Genesis now in order to play Champion Edition is like, oh, wait, I just got to wait 6 months or whatever, and it'll be showing up on my Super Nintendo.
And you want to wait 6 months, because once you've played Turbo, you cannot go back to OG-style Street Fighter 2.
And that's one of those things. The Turbo Graphics kids must have been like, yay, we're going to get it too! Obviously, it doesn't get released in North America, but, at least the hope was there for a hot minute. I don't know, were Turbo Graphics Hue cards region locked? I don't even know.
I probably not, because I'm not sure how you would, but I can't speak on that with authority.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's one of those things where obviously there's going to be more of this stuff coming down the pipeline, and just because one version's coming out on one console is not necessarily going to mean that you need to buy a new console now.
That's right. Yeah. Save it for when Mortal Kombat comes out.
Which is just around the corner.
But it's not all doom and gloom in Sega land, because Castlevania is coming to the Genesis.
Konami is finally making the plunge and porting one of its biggest franchises to Sega's Genesis. Other big franchises such as Contra and TMNT can't be far behind.
Yep, I mean, it's hitting now. This is the year where it's really hitting that this Genesis is a big deal in the United States, and so all of these Japanese companies with very close ties to Nintendo that were never going to break ranks to put stuff on the Genesis in their domestic market where the sales were puny are finally to the point where they cannot ignore the Genesis in the United States, and so have to give them something, though most of the time that something is inferior to what they're giving Nintendo, as with the example of Champion Edition versus Turbo in the Street Fighter world.
Yeah. I mean, and for all of... I mean, there's arguments to be made for Bloodlines, which is a Castlevania game on Genesis, and Hardcore. But, yeah, I mean, they're not...
But not Hyperstone Heist.
No.
Hyperstone Heist is a very, very poor man's Turtles in Time.
Yeah. And so it's, Konami's going to do a base effort. I mean, Rocket Ranger, I do believe that plays a little bit better on Genesis than on Super NES, but it's been way too long since I played them. But yeah, it's too little too late. And let's face it, it's 1993, 94 is already going to see Japan getting the new consoles. There's already been some rumorations about what might be coming, so, it's yeah. But it is fun to see the battle is heating up for the U.S. market. I'm sure that Sega of America won't start shooting themselves in the foot and killing their profitability in any way.
No, certainly not. In fact, right now they're doing things that will help make things even more profitable as things heat up, as Sega reduces cartridge production costs.
Sega of America has, according to Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine, noticeably, that's their word, reduced the cost of cartridge production for its third parties. While the exact price change isn't revealed, it is no doubt a sign of the increasing competition between console makers to court third-party software publishers. And I think for those who are dyed in the wool and know all this stuff, I don't have to give this explanation, but I think it's probably useful for some of our listeners to just recap briefly how cartridge manufacturing worked back in the day, and to a certain extent still does. So the individual publishers did not traditionally manufacture their own cartridges. This is why the cartridges were all so uniform, because they were being made by the console maker.
With just so the Department of Corrections doesn't get crazy, with a few exceptions of very influential companies that were able to cut their own special deals.
Exactly. Or companies that managed to get around the any kind of protections that were in there, and by reverse engineering, EA being one of them, and so forth. But traditionally, you basically sent them your code and said, hey, please make 10,000 copies of this for me. Oh, you're only going to make 5,000 copies of my game while my competitor gets 20,000 copies? Okay, I'm going to say that's okay because you have me over the barrel and I have to do whatever you say. And this is fair. Sorry, I just had to get that out of my system. So,
are you sure you were not in a past life a third party dealing with one of these? Because that sounded personal. That sounded like you were there, Gandalf.
What can I say? It's it may have been. No, it's just one of those situations where just seeing that kind of setup kind of makes you think maybe it's a rigged system just a little bit.
Well, exactly. And then, of course, you were really throwing darts at the wall because there was a 3-month lead time to manufacture cartridges. So you had to try to get it right the first time. You had to figure out 3 months in advance how good you thought your game was going to do, because with the way it's a hits-driven market, except for really exceptional games, you're only going to get that initial order to sell your game. By the time you can realize a game is selling and order another round of production, that's another 3 months. And within 3 months, your demand is almost guaranteed to be gone.
Yeah. And so if you even get into the window for their production, because getting closer and closer to Christmas, that 3 months could very easily increase dramatically. And of course, you're also competing against the console makers themselves, who aren't paying the same amount. So your game might be shipping on a 4 megabit cartridge because you can't afford anything more. But of course, the console makers drop in, 16 and 24-bit cartridges because they don't really care as much.
Because they weren't doing this at cost. They were not providing the services at cost to the third parties. They were, the hardware companies were making money off of third parties every which way but loose, and this was just another way. There were, licensing fees, and there were manufacturing fees. It's just crazy.
And they would also test your software. So you thought you had a great window, and they're like, no, you got to go back and do all this bug fixing or change something. And now you just missed your window to get it into the shops.
Yep.
If you guys want a better idea of this, I'll put a link to my Wild Bill Steely interview where he talked about how he was approached to become an NES licensee early on. And when they told him the deal, he was just like, no? Are you crazy?
Yeah. Screw you guys. I'll just do arcade games instead. The kids love those.
Yeah. He'll be the first to admit, not a great business decision. So this idea, we don't know exactly how much they reduced it by, but the editors over at Video Games and Computer Entertainment said that they saw the numbers and that it was very noticeable. So whatever this change was, Sega is clearly trying to get more third parties over. This may or may not have influenced, companies like Konami and so forth coming over. But what it's going to do long term is it's really, really going to hurt their profitability in the market.
Absolutely. And, I have no insider info on this, but I would not be surprised if this is something that some of the big Japanese companies like Konami and Capcom forced on them as a condition to bring their software over, because Sega did have a software problem. They did need software, and those companies really did have them over a barrel a bit. But like I said, I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, and this is the thing. They don't say who their source is, if it's Sega itself or if it's one of the third parties. But yeah, you're right. The Genesis is really suffering from a lack of software at this point. And the American manufacturers, the American publishers just aren't really making the kind of software that works well on console at this juncture. They need somebody else. They need the Japanese to come in, or they at least need new blood from North America or Europe to make console-ready games. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Price is going to be it. Oh, well, so I'm sure Nintendo is just going to take this, laying back, not worrying. They've got the FX chip. What else do they need to do?
Well, they are going to do some experimenting of their own as well, and thank you for setting me up so nicely there, as Nintendo announces Super Famicom Online Play.
Nintendo has shown off the adapter that will allow Super Famicom players in Japan to take their games online using digital radio service Sento Giga, and I'm probably killing the pronunciation of that. Online matches of Super Mario Kart could be on the horizon. So, yeah. Now this device that they're showing off, now I'm blanking on the actual name of it again. It's the online thingamabob for the Super Famicom. What do they call it again? Famicom modem. It's the Satellaview, sorry.
Oh, so, right. Well, of course, Satellaview, yeah.
Yeah, so they're showing off a prototype of the Satellaview. And this system obviously is supposed to be coming out in 94 already. It won't actually ship until 1995. So it's way too late, and they're not going to release it outside of Japan. Satellite radio at this point in Japan has already got a certain amount of penetration, but it's also still not huge. From what my understanding, I did a little bit of research into it. And there seems to have been a news report in Japan about Nintendo investing in into this satellite radio company, Sento Giga. But I haven't been able to find any confirmation as to whether or not they outright bought them or they just invested in them, which was very common practice for the Japanese companies. That I don't know for sure. But whatever the case may be, Sento Giga thinks that this will help them, boost their, user base. But at the same time, let's face it, by the time this comes out in 1995, the next generation of consoles is already there. It's too little, too late, and it's not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely. But you can't blame Nintendo for trying some new things, because there's definitely troubling developments in 16-bit land as Japanese cart prices drop fast.
And this isn't really news, but something interesting I ran across in GamePro magazine this month about how Japanese game cart prices seem to drop fairly fast after release. They gave an example of a game costing less than half after just a few months. I don't know enough about the market, but the article claims that games, even for relevantly new systems like the Super Famicom, are coming out so fast that they are pushing releases off the shelves much more quickly than in the US. This would make it sound almost like the home computer game industry in England and Spain in this time period.
Yeah, and I can't say that I have a huge amount of insight into the Japanese retail market in this period, but I will say that, some of this is just kind of the hangover effect of the Famicom boom. The Famicom boom specifically, it's not just the entire period that the NES or the family computer was out. It's specifically the period 1983 to 1986 when the family computer experienced its greatest success. And at that time, a lot of companies saw the big successes in that space and started just flocking into that console space. There were so many more little developers and publishers in Japan. And in the Famicom era, that worked because for a long period of time, the Famicom hardware itself was very scarce. And so what retailers would do would be that they would take all of this other inferior software they're getting and put them into bundles that they would sell with the Famicom systems, but they would require you to take the software bundle as part of the overall package. And consumers had no choice because they couldn't go someplace else to get a Famicom because it was so supply constrained. And I'm just speculating here, but I have to wonder if part of what's happening here is kind of this way that the market worked, where the retailers were perfectly happy to just throw in software with sales of scarce hardware and, charge a little more for it. I mean, it's not like they just threw it in for free. Created a system, an ecosystem where there were so many of these publishers that someplace like in the United States in the Atari crash would have just gone under. But instead in Japan, they were making just enough money to get by. But now they're all here and they're all still going. And so you really have too many publishers and too many developers in Japan making this console software that all sprang up during this Famicom boom period. And now they're finding it hard to balance, price and shelf space and all of this stuff in the 16-bit era.
That was one of my theories going into this. The other idea that I had was, and this goes back to my interview with Jerry Wolosenko, when he was contrasting, because he was doing the distribution for Psygnosis in the United States. And he always had the problem that in Europe, Psygnosis would be outputting a new game or two a month. And they wanted him to take that over to the States. He was like, no, you don't understand. The retail landscape is very different. The stuff's got to be able to sit on the shelf for 6 months, 7 months before it moves. If we keep throwing more product out there, the retailers simply won't buy it. The retailers are basically keeping an artificially high price tag by limiting the new supply of games coming on the market. Whereas in Europe, it was already, hey, the newest game sells, everything else is old, and then we're going to do a budget re-release in 6 months. And obviously cartridges, whole different life cycle, whole different cost structure for manufacturing than in discs. But if what you're saying is true and still applying here, that you have way too many small publishers, and it may just be that they're paying smaller fees for manufacturing or licensing fees, or there's more of them that have the ability to publish themselves. I don't know what the situation is in Japan there in this period, but I think it might also have to do with retail. I mean, you probably didn't have the big box stores, a handful of big box store chains controlling such a large portion of the market like you did in the States, where, that would constrain, what publishers are willing to put out there.
Well, there was, at least, I can't speak for the Sega side, but there was a lot of control on the Nintendo side, actually, at the distribution level. There was a powerful, essentially, cartel called the Shoshinkai that controlled all distribution of Nintendo products in Japan. And it was a trade organization of distributors. And it didn't start out as a Nintendo exclusive operation, but in the early days of the Famicom, this was the group that Yamauchi courted to be his distribution, and then they became so intertwined with each other that basically the Shoshinkai became an exclusively Nintendo distribution-based organization, and you could not get a Nintendo game, a game for a Nintendo system, on retail shelves if you did not go through the Shoshinkai. And,
okay.
Yeah, and so, Nintendo let this happen to a degree, because the Shoshinkai could have decided it wasn't worth it and shut it down. And I don't know exactly what all the economics here were, but there was that level of control at the top, even tighter control in some ways than what you saw big retailers being able to exert in the U.S.
Interesting. I wonder then whether or not that translated, and for our listeners here, it's just Alex and I completely speculating. If anybody has done any research or has experience with the Japanese market at this time, drop me a line. Emails in the description. Love to talk to you about it and maybe get some hands-on information to basically clear up this question, because like I said, this was just an offhanded remark in GamePro, link in the show notes. Remember, everything we talk about, links are in the show notes. And it just sparked my imagination as to what this market must have looked like in comparison with the U.S. market where, game's going to cost $70 day one, and a year later it still costs $70.
Yeah, the U.S. was even in computer games for a long time, the U.S. market was just very immune to the whole idea of budget software. Now, in the late 80s, this is a bit of a tangent, but in the late 80s, some of the American computer game companies did introduce budget lines inspired by what was going on in Britain. But on the whole, the idea of budget software is just not something that in the U.S. ever took off as an idea with consumers and with publishers who are, of course, shaping with their marketing what the consumer's idea of value is in that space.
Well, also, if you look at where software was being sold primarily, you either had the mom and pop shops that definitely did not want their retail space dropping in profitability. You had the big department stores that would have just a tiny little sliver of their store dedicated to this. So they also don't want their inventory losing value. They don't have the space, or they're not dedicating enough space for, your rack of cheap games. And the three sisters, Electronics Boutique, Game, Software, etc., and not GameStop, Babbage's. They're also not in the business of getting rid of this stuff. What you are missing that you had in Europe, especially in England, was the W.H. Smiths of this world. Mm-hmm. The companies that are actually making their money normally off of magazines and stuff, small quantities, and for them to set up a spinner rack, with the cheap stuff, makes perfect sense. But you don't have that body in the United States because the kind of store that would be able to do that is not a store that you jump in a car to drive to. Mm-hmm. And a W.H. Smith is something you pass on your way to school or on your way to work as you're walking through town in a city like a London or whatever. And I think that is one of the major factors keeping that price consistency.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But, oh well. Okay, enough speculation. Let's get back to hard facts, things you can hold in your hand.
That's right, and enough about these console things. We are done with them for another month. We are moving on to the electronic handhelds, toys, etc. space as Tomy brings Barcode Battler to the West.
The handheld device that allows players to battle one another by swiping barcodes from products through a reader built into the device has already sold over 1.5 million units in Japan and will now come to the West. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, this kind of thing really never caught on in the West, but it was always big in Japan. Even a decade after this, the arcade, the coin-op market was suddenly overtaken by games where you scanned barcodes of various stuff at the arcade to scan your characters into these big arcade games and whatnot. But it just never resonated in the same way in the West.
Yeah, this whole idea of, I don't even know what it is. These things don't have graphics. It just basically displays a number as far as I understand.
Right.
It's like, okay, you scan this code in and it gives you 42. It's like, ooh, what number do you have from your Coke can? Well, you can't do a Coke can because it actually has to be of a certain size and everything else. And people are having to cut stuff off and tape it to cardboard or whatever to pass it through the machine. It's nonsense.
Yeah, you think QR codes are annoying. Let me tell you about the days of the UPC code.
Exactly. And I guess it's the Pokemon thing, gotta catch them all and meet a random person on the street and be like, let's battle.
Yeah, that's the idea of it. And, that kind of thing is never done as well in the U.S. And part of that is just population density. Like in Japan, these kind of things, because of course Street Pass in Japan, on the DS and whatnot, was also very popular. But that's because most of the population lives in hyper-condensed Tokyo, but also B, because cost of living is so high in Tokyo, no one actually lives very close to where they go to work or school. And so they're always surrounded by people, and they're always doing hour-plus commutes on the subway. And that's why these things really catch on in Japan, because you really can meet a bunch of random strangers. Whereas in the US, a lot less population density, and even in most places where the population density is higher, people are off in their own little worlds in their own cars. A lot less use of mass transit, except for, very specific exceptions like New York City.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, okay. It makes sense now. I mean, that concept, yeah. No, I'm sold. You've convinced me that is a perfect explanation for it.
All right, my job here is done. This has been another edition of the Video Game Newsroom. No,
we're not done.
No, we people know.
We're not even at the halfway point.
Exactly. We can't get through this stuff that quickly. But we will move on to our next topic, which is Konami's Arcade Boy will turn your Game Boy into an arcade cabinet.
Konami has shown off the Arcade Boy, a tabletop unit that allows you to play your Game Boy games with an arcade stick and buttons, as well as increasing the size of the screen. Just slide your Game Boy into the back of the unit, add some batteries to boost the audio output, and away you go.
That's right, because the whole reason people bought a portable game system is so that they could pretend it wasn't a portable game system.
Yes, but at the same time, and this thing doesn't come out as the Arcade Boy. It gets launched in Japan as the Hyper Boy. And it really is just, you move the joystick up and it pushes the up button through mechanical means. But, when you think about it, yeah, it's meant to be portable, but if you're a kid and it's the only system you've got or something, or you're at home, you don't want to be holding it in your hand the whole time. This is kind of a nifty, cool concept. Now, screen is still going to be crap, but, it's an interesting concept. Maybe. No, you're not convinced.
I'm just not convinced. It's just, the whole point of the Game Boy and the games that are made on the Game Boy is that they are meant to be kind of on the go. Now, obviously there's some amazing deep games on it, like Metroid 2 or Link's Awakening, but it's like it kind of removes like the whole point of having a Game Boy. The Super Game Boy kind of suffered from the same problem. Now, I say that as someone who actually owned a Super Game Boy before they owned a Game Boy, so make of that what you will. But it's like, if you want that bigger, fuller experience, you're going to play a game on a console or in an arcade. The reason you put up with the generally more limited gameplay, with exceptions like the amazing Link's Awakening, but the generally more limited gameplay of a Game Boy is that it's portable. So when you just have it at home and you're playing it as a non-portable, it just calls attention to the fact that you are not playing something as cool as your NES or Super NES or Famicom or Super Famicom.
I agree. And, if you're going to find a market hole for this, a place in the market, it would be for the people who don't have any other system other than a Game Boy.
Yeah, but this is the bubble economy. Homeless people probably have a family computer.
Okay, you are correct there. And there is a reason probably why this never gets released outside of Japan.
Yeah, points for trying, but it just feels like you can't turn the Game Boy into an acceptable at-home system. So why try?
Good point. Now, if they had made a compatible system with a better screen that you could pop your Game Boy cartridges into,
then maybe.
As somebody who never owned a Game Boy, remembers the eye strain of trying to play Operation C on a buddy's Game Boy and just being like, I don't know what just killed me. Oh, there was a shot there.
The gray blur killed you.
Yes, but has since then played through Operation C using emulators, and it's an amazing freaking game. I can only say there was so much more potential in that hardware sans that monitor or that screen, and anybody who could have released a better screen for that hardware at that time, even if it was more sedentary, would have been able to tap into a whole mess of games that people struggled with otherwise.
I think they basically just call that the Super Game Boy, Carl.
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is, if you'd done it as a small standalone device, it would have been cheaper than buying a Super Game Boy plus a Super Nintendo.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's very true, certainly.
Yeah. But you're right. Yeah, the Super Game Boy did kind of solve that problem. But then again, like you just argued, what was the point of doing that if that's why you accepted the inferior product?
Right.
Okay, yeah.
So enough about handhelds. We have solved the handheld problem once and for all. They may never appear again on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, for all I know.
Until next month.
Well, shh. So we're moving on to computers, where court gives AMD go-ahead to make 486s.
After a 486s or 486s? No. You're allowed to make 4.
Right.
Yeah. So, sorry. Okay. After a jury decision against AMD, which we reported on several months ago, a court has overturned that decision and decreed that AMD can go ahead and produce 486 chips. While AMD itself will only be able to produce an estimated 1 million chips this year to Intel's 6 million, opening the market to other third parties could finally mean that supply of the chips will meet demand.
It is the litigation that keeps on giving and giving and giving. But at this point, Intel's probably just shrugging, and it's like, they're not allowed to make Pentiums.
And that is one of the big things that they talk about in the magazines. I mean, the Pentium's already out there. The prices of upgrading the computers to keep up with the times, and that's going to be a theme for the rest of the show today. Is getting there, but the 486 still hasn't reached mass market potential, really. I mean, it's mass market, but the vast majority of players still don't have a 486 at home. They're still way too expensive. And this opening up of the 486 market is finally going to bring those prices down. And just as game developers are starting to embrace the Pentium, it's insane. But, I mean, without this decision, if the 486 hadn't been as plentiful, how many people really would have been playing a lot of Doom? Mm-hmm. Doom is just around the corner. It's gonna really need a 486. Yep. Playing it on a 386 is not really playing Doom. And so this decision is coming just at the right time to get Doom up and running, because you don't need a Pentium for it.
Right. That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Very cool. But speaking of hardware upgrades, though, Creative Labs shows off Sound Blaster 16 at CeBIT.
The CeBIT Tech Show in Hanover saw the public debut of the Sound Blaster 16, the 16-bit variant of Creative Labs' sound card for PCs. The card would go on to become a de facto standard for years to come.
Yes, I didn't read ahead to see it was a German show. CeBIT. There we go. Yeah. CeBIT. Yes.
And I actually think this was the one I was at. I was either at the 93 or 94 CeBIT. No, it must have been the 94, because I kept asking at the Silicon Graphics booth if they already had any demos of the it wasn't N64 yet, the
Project Reality.
Project Reality. And they were like, no, we don't do that. We're not that division. It was because it's mainly an industrial show.
Right.
But yeah. So yeah, they're showing off the Sound Blaster 16. Intel is showing off the Pentium. It's one of the first times where consumers got their hands on with it. Creative also showed off the Video Blaster, which was their FMV enhancement board, which doesn't really take off, but gives us a little indication of, Sillywood is coming. Spoilers for the rest of the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously, with all of this going on, and I didn't put this in the notes, but there is also Atari is showing off the Falcon. It's going to be Atari's last Sabit show. Commodore, which has always had a giant stand at Sabit, still has their giant stand at Sabit this year. That's not going to be the case next year.
Spoilers.
They're debuting, or at least showing off a demo of the an Amiga 4000T, the giant tower version of the Amiga 4000. And yeah,
it's a crossroads right here. I mean, the last of kind of the old and the first of the new, where it'll be the Intel processors and the PC peripherals that drive the market rather than the Ataris and Commodores of the world. Even in Europe, where for the longest time they spelled IBM COMMODORE.
Exactly, and it really is this. You get the feeling, and we've talked about this on the show before, but every month the editorial and the biggest Amiga magazine in Germany is called Amiga Joker. Mm-hmm. For the last year and a half, they've had a spin-off, PC Joker, PC Gaming Mag, and the editorial of virtually every issue of Amiga Joker has been, we're not dead yet, right? No, we're not dead yet. The magazine's going to last until at least 96, but already at this point, they're just like, no, things aren't that bad. Yeah, everybody knows the writing's on the wall. It's just a question of, can you afford to upgrade? And for most people, that answer is still no. But at a certain point, why bother with the other machines?
Exactly.
So, okay, fun stuff.
Meanwhile, we got one of those where I just don't have a transition, so my commenting on not having a transition becomes the perfect transition, as EPA hopes Energy Star will help save the planet.
The American Environmental Protection Agency's Energy Star program to promote the creation of energy-saving computers, which started last year with just 8 companies, has now expanded to over 50 manufacturers and covers everything from printers and monitors to system software. One of the major features of Energy Star products is that they can power down to just 30 watts when not in use. One more time. The EPA fears that without Energy Star, computers and peripherals will consume 70 billion kilowatt hours of energy by the year 2000, assuming 70 million PCs and workstations will be in use.
This is an interesting one to me because, I didn't really know much about Energy Star, but I mean, every monitor I owned for years and years and years had that big Energy Star logo, right on the front of it.
Yeah, and I didn't know the history of it either. I ran across this article in Byte magazine, and then I was like, okay, how much is that? It was sort of like, the 1.21 gigawatts from Back to the Future. What does that even mean? And the idea here, I looked up, Bitcoin alone consumes 127 terawatt hours of power every year.
Jeez.
And, they're worried about 70 billion kilowatt hours. So, the numbers are a whole different ballgame from what they were worried about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I don't think Energy Star was ready for that. And I don't think there's a lot of Energy Star compliant video cards coming out nowadays. Maybe I'm wrong. If somebody knows if I'm wrong, please let me know.
More power. More power to the video card.
Yes. Make it the strongest machine in the house. You thought your dryer was an energy hog? Turn on that Radeon, baby. Yeah.
That's right. Note that AMD and ATI did not pay for that endorsement of the power of Radeon.
I wish I could be that kind of shit.
And speaking...
I don't know if I've mentioned it on here, but I actually got one email asking if I'd do sponsorship on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was for Blue Chew. And when I told them how many people actually listened, they just didn't even bother writing back. That's sad. So everybody, tell all your friends about the show so that I can finally get paid to do a Blue Chew ad. Okay.
Gotta have goals. Gotta have goals in this business. But speaking of shilling products in any possible way you can, Windows is coming to everything.
Byte's cover story this month is about the multi-pronged approach Microsoft is taking to its Windows GUI. NT is its first real foray into integration of DOS and the Windows graphical interface. The Win32 and Win32S systems are beginning to bring integration across versions of Windows, and variants such as modular Windows used in Tandy's set-top CD system that we've talked about on the show, a potential pen-based system for the PDA market, and the upcoming Chicago, aka Windows 95 system, could bring a unified OS to any possible screen-enabled device one can think of. Stumbling blocks such as memory and CPU requirements, as well as the lack of proper graphics APIs, remain, but Microsoft has already begun to address these by licensing OpenGL for integration into NT, but it won't ship with the first version.
I tell you, obviously Windows NT becomes exceptionally great at integrating the entire personal computer space of operating systems, but with all that other stuff, you can take the Windows off the PC, but you can't take the PC off the Windows, because the stumbling block has always been with Microsoft when they've tried to expand their OS out of that space, is that they barely pay lip service to modifying their OSs to meet the specific needs of another type of product. It's just throwing PC Windows on something else.
Yeah, I mean, and they're going to keep doing it. We talked about this when we used to do 30-year jumps and talked about the launch of the Dreamcast with Windows CE on there. Mm-hmm. This dream of Windows as a unified platform on everything, it's almost like, it's the same problems that CP/M dealt with 10 years earlier, where in theory it's the same operating system, but as soon as you move to a different processor, screw it, none of your software's going to work.
Yep.
And it's just not going to function. I mean, Xbox not going to be Windows compatible. The famous, Bill Gates exploding. What do you mean it's not going to be on Windows?
And it was always a horrible operating system on PDAs. It was always a horrible operating system on phones, because they just were like, well, we can just take Windows and we can put it on these other things. And it's like, nope. But to not just completely beat them up, I mean, obviously the NT initiative they're doing here will just beautifully take over the world of PCs once it gets a release for the general public, for the hoi polloi, in its form of Windows XP, which remains probably the most successful operating system of all time when you combine reach and stability and everything else together into one metric.
Yeah, and let's not also forget that Windows 95, what it did for sales of machines And the ease, the relative ease with which people were suddenly able to get online also had a major impact on all of this.
The government had something to say about that, too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we will be talking about that. Actually, in our 30-year jump, we already talked about it because those lawsuits are going to take a while. Back when we still did 30-year jumps, don't worry, we'll wrap around, people. The show will go on. But the fun thing here, the last bit that they talked about in the article, and it sort of isn't even a major issue, but the fact that they're trying to integrate OpenGL into the system. And for those who have already listened to my interview with Servan Kyonjian, this is around the same time that they're basically going to buy up his software to turn into Direct3D. So DirectX is also a concept in the background here. Obviously, all of this stuff either doesn't have an official name yet or isn't being released to the public. But this idea of the operating system dealing with graphics production and the role that 3D graphics and 2D graphics are going to be playing moving forward is obviously something Microsoft is already thinking about, and the fact that people are buying the more powerful machines in order to play games is not completely lost on them. Mm-hmm. Especially if you've tried to install something like Ultima 7 on a DOS machine, you know that something needs to be done.
Oh my goodness, yes. But Microsoft isn't the only company out there in computer land that is talking about unifying product, because Maxis wants to unify game data.
We spoke last year about the idea floated by Will Wright to create universal game data files that could be imported into different games. At the Software Publishers Association annual event, Jeff Brown, president of Maxis, took up this quest with what he is calling co-opetition. Cooperation between competitors. Mallard Software is working on a flight sim that would use map data generated in SimCity, and Imagineer will work on a racing game using SimCity data, and Reality Technologies would build a real estate speculation game around such data.
Okay, you do that, Maxis. You do that.
Well, and the weird thing is, and I did laugh about this a year or two ago when Peter Molyneux was playing around with the same idea. Where he was like, why can't I take the landscape from Powermonger and, dump it into some other game or something? And, obviously I laughed at it because it was Peter Molyneux doing what Peter Molyneux does. Right. Just talking off the cuff and coming up with weird ideas that his developers then have to cringe and be like, no, we're not going to be able to carve our name into the tree and all that stuff. But this idea coming from Will Wright will actually lead to some fruits. I mean, we're going to get Simcopter. We're going to get Streets of SimCity. I mean, you covered this recently on your Will Wright episode.
Absolutely.
So there is something here. I really would have loved to see the property speculation game, because that could be interesting.
And I mean, there are specific scenarios where you can make something like this work, like Simcopter flying around in your SimCity. But the thing is, I mean, different games just have such different needs in terms of engine capability and assets and frame rate and all of these other things that you really can't. And I mean, just look at Star Citizen. One of the many major problems that Star Citizen had is even within a single game, not even trying to interface with other publishers, they were trying to integrate a space combat mode and a first-person on-the-ground combat mode and all these other things, and they couldn't even get these separate modules of their own game, which they're controlling every part of, to play nice with each other, which is one of the 10 million problems with it. So just imagine trying to get games across competitors, even if everyone is willing to be totally open about their source code, which is a big if. It's just serving those needs is almost impossible.
Well, and also just think about what data you're actually sharing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're taking a SimCity building, there's certain statistical values and attributes that building has that are necessary for SimCity, but there's no three-dimensional model behind that in SimCity. Mm-hmm. So, how tall really is the building? You have no idea. It's a certain number of pixels as a sprite, but if you're trying to turn that into a 3D model for a racing game, you need to now completely re-render that and have a 3D rendered version of it, a 3D model that you are then associating with the data to maybe put it into a relative position, but that's it. There's no way to do this without really just creating new data. It's the same nonsense when people were talking about, well, with my NFTs, I can have my NFT that I then walk around in the game with. What the fuck does that even mean? What do you mean? You're going to have a 3D model of your two-dimensional cat?
Right.
Randomly generated cat? Are you nuts? Yeah. How does that even work? What's the physics of that? Oh, but it's an NFT. It's something, right? No, it's nothing, you dumbass.
Which, thank God, it seems like everyone's starting to catch on to. It feels like we're passing that very brief boom.
You know what? I'd like to think that's true. And now everybody's just jumping on the AI bandwagon. Mm-hmm. But, it's dumbasses. Oh, well. Thankfully, central banks keep increasing the money supply, so it's got to go someplace. Now, sorry. Yep. I'm getting off the soapbox. Now, a couple of other interesting bits about this conference. Much was made about the challenges to PC gaming created by console gaming. And some industry players are urging for designs to be usable on both PC and console. As the console market is bigger, gamers are getting older, and shelf space at retail is shrinking, making the variations in PC boxes no longer tenable. So, these ideas of PC games need to learn lessons from the consoles. You cannot ignore the console market. You've got to be designing for both. Was a big theme at this year's conference. And yeah, that's going to be a hard transition for the classic computer game makers to make.
Absolutely.
Then again, I mean, they're going to be looking at shiny stuff. So who knows?
And boy, do we have some turmoil in that computer game space to talk about in the back part of the episode here. Starting with Andy Hollis leaves Microprose.
Simulation legend Andy Hollis, responsible for games such as Gunship and F-15 Strike Eagle 2, has left Microprose to join Origin. He won't stay long at the EA subsidiary before leading the development of EA's Jane's Combat Simulator series of games.
Yeah, I mean, this was a real coup for Origin and EA at the time, because we're right at the tail end here of the time when military simulations were like the AAA game of the PC space. They were the Call of Duty of PCs. Now, they only sold in the hundreds of thousands of units, not the tens of millions of units, but that was flagship stuff, and Hollis was a big name in that space.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, as somebody who played a inordinate amount of Gunship on a C64, I can tell you, especially the first game I actually ever bought, that should tell you something. His name is Legend, but it's also interesting because this news is breaking just as Strike Commander's coming out, and you haven't played Strike Commander,
But I have heard tale.
You have heard tales. Basically, it's this weird hybrid of take all of the story type stuff from Wing Commander and try to make an actual flight sim while still being actiony.
Right, and fully polygonal, unlike the early Wing Commander games, which used sprite rotations to give the illusion of that 3D space.
And if you have a Pentium that won't be out for another 2 years, it'll actually work with textures. But the problem is that melding of those two types of games does not function at all. I mean, to the point where it's, and this is basically just my opinion, is unplayable garbage.
That's the opinion of most people at the time, too. I mean, it sold pretty well on the Chris Robertson Origin name, but when people got it, it was like, oh no, what have I done?
Well, and that's the funny thing, that the reviewers are giving it fairly high marks, while still arguing that, yeah, maybe this isn't going to appeal to anybody. It's really funny to read the reviews, because that's literally what's going on in the reviews this month is, yeah, it's trying to be a real hardcore simulation, but you have to sit through the cinematics and you don't actually properly take off or stuff. I mean,
and oh look, my game crashed again.
That too. So yeah, I mean, it satisfies no one, but it's interesting that they were going in that direction, and that Andy Hollis goes to Origin first and not directly to EA.
Right.
And it feels very much like, and they do then their World War II spin-off game from Strike Commander, which does somewhat better, but is also not really going to take off, not like Dynamics' Aces of the Pacific, for example,
right,
which gets away from all of that and sticks with the historical accuracy.
Right.
And that's what Jane's is going to do, is stick with the accuracy, and that's what the simulators want.
Right, and it was really the last great flight simulator series. And I don't mean great as in the last one that was fun to play, but it was the last one that kind of caught the tail end of that mainstream commercial success of flight simulators.
Exactly. So yeah, it's an interesting point of transition, and it goes towards what they were saying is like, pick a lane, decide what you're going to do, and yeah, Strike Commander is going to tarnish a lot of names. But hey, okay, so that didn't work. We're just going to go, how do we make these type of games better on PC? Do we make them like console games, or do we add FMV? Sorry.
Meanwhile, speaking of Sillywood and media companies and all of that, Viacom buys ICOM.
Media empire Viacom has purchased interactive movie pioneer ICOM, makers of the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective series. The connection with Viacom will lead to the Beavis and Butthead point-and-click adventures. I can't even do it.
Oh, Viacom, of all the media companies, Viacom was the blink and you miss it one. They got in and out so fast.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird because ICOM is really, I mean, they're ahead of the game. The Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, that was the first, FMV game that I was aware of.
And it's actually not bad.
No, that's the worst part. And and it's a mold that they could keep using and abusing for years if they wanted to. I mean, they did 3 of them. The third one's about to come out at this point. And they could have just kept doing more adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it would have kept selling because it wasn't going to be, it's not going to be the disaster the other ones are. Right. It lends itself to that format.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, they're going to have to now use Viacom properties, and apparently that's
they will have to become the Great Cornholio.
That's true. Although some of those games weren't terrible, but they're not going to be great either.
In fairness, though, Viacom realized their mistake pretty quickly and kind of got right back out with their interactive stuff. But they aren't the only ones going interactive, because Trimark gets interactive as well.
Oh yes, B-movie maker Trimark, famous for the Warlock and Leprechaun films, has entered the video game fray with Trimark Interactive. They plan to leverage their existing properties and film expertise and won't be shooting to release game designs on all available platforms, but target games to the platforms that best suit them, considering factors such as the average age of the platform's users.
I mean, I don't have much to say about this, except that there's an alternate dimension where I could give you the complete inside scoop on Trimark Interactive, because they actually tap Kelly Flock, who at the time was president of LucasArts, to run Trimark Interactive.
Oh, really?
And yes, they did. And I interviewed Kelly Flock way back in the day, and we got through LucasArts, because he was at EA, then he was at Activision, then he was LucasArts, then Trimark, then Sony. And then, whatever after. But we got through LucasArts, and that was the end of that wonderful part one. He said he was willing to do a part two. I tried a couple of times to get a hold of him, as sometimes happens. It, didn't get back a hold of him, and then he did pass away in 2020, so now it's too late. But there's an alternate universe where we got that part two interview set up, and then I spent the next 5 minutes here telling you all about Trimark Interactive. But instead, he's dead and I got nothing.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, it is an interesting little tidbit, because they last a couple of years. Mm-hmm. They do a Warlock game for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. They do a National Lampoon's game that's a CD-ROM thing, sort of a dating simulator, that actually gets decent reviews for, decent acting. They're really leveraging the fact that they have access to real actors. They do White Men Can't Jump on the Jaguar. I always wondered where the hell that thing came from. And, this explains it. Trimark being a B-movie company that was probably involved in the production. Yeah. And the fact that they were, and if this is true, this idea that they wanted to tailor each game to the platform, White Men Can't Jump on the Jaguar uses sprite scaling and stuff that you wouldn't have been able to do on other platforms at the time. So it kind of makes sense. And then they've got The Hive. I don't know how that entered the whole setup.
Yeah, I'm so sad I never got to pick Kelly Flock's brain about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be somebody else who was involved.
Undoubtedly. I mean, companies are never just one person. I'm sure there's some people we could hunt down to get some more of the story. But it is part of this whole Sillywood game. I mean, in this period of time, the media companies, because of the whole emphasis on multimedia and multimedia PCs and multimedia set-top players like Tandy's thing and Commodore CDTV and CDI and all of that, there was this real thought that there was a melding of these two forms of entertainment that was about to happen, and the media companies thought they had to get in on this or they were going to be left behind.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, when you think about it, you didn't want to miss the boat.
Nope.
And yeah.
And they thought it was right up their alley, because they figured that this multimedia thing meant that they needed script writers and directors and actors, and they didn't stop to think about the fact that they also need, like, game designers.
Game designers? Who needs game designers?
It's such a fascinating cultural, like, mismatch, and the way these two sides just completely drove past each other. They were like ships passing in the night, where they both thought that they were, the game side and the media side both thought they knew where they were going, and they were both just wrong. Though obviously the game people were able to pivot because when they realized, oh, it really is about game design, we have people that can do that, they were able to pivot and save themselves, whereas the media companies, it's like, game design?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very, very different discipline from, well, we're going to have a linear product that manipulates your emotions in a very specific way at a very specific time, regardless of what you'd like the character to do. And yeah, and the worst part is most of these guys are going to be trying to do this not on consoles, but on the PC, where the sales figures aren't that great to begin with.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
But there's no doubt that there's a gold rush going on in this time period, and it's not just the media companies noticing this, it's definitely also the VC companies as well. And one example we can see of that is Spectrum Holobyte gets cash infusion.
Just as Microprose, SSI, and Sierra are struggling and laying off staff to look interesting to investors, which we talked about last month, Spectrum Holobyte has received $10.3 million in cash infusion. The flight sim aficionados who have been investing heavily in VR and bought the Star Trek The Next Generation license for PC and Super Nintendo have gotten the money from a group of investors including Vertex Management, Edison Brothers, with whom they are developing VR centers, and Paramount Communications, makers of Star Trek The Next Generation.
Shout out to Edison Brothers. There was a St. Louis department store that decided they should get into arcades and bought Dave & Buster's, amongst other things. Dave & Buster's, of course, which we've just talked about in a recent episode. But yeah, I mean, there's a sense here that there's some kind of future between the VR craze, which is very much going on right now, between the Sillywood thing, the multimedia thing, of course, Nintendo and Sega moving so many millions of units of their console. There's a real sense that there's a new form of entertainment maturing here, and people really want to be in on that. And Spectrum Holobyte was in desperate need of money because they had been part of the Maxwell Group, and the Maxwell Group was kind of going through a bit of a rough patch involving their founder falling off a boat and not telling anyone where he had embezzled all the pension fund first.
There was that.
And it was doubly bad. I mean, obviously that was trouble for every Maxwell entity, but it was doubly bad for Spectrum Holobyte because for some reason, and I've interviewed Gilman Louie, he has no idea why, but for some reason the investigators became convinced that all of that pension money was being hidden, had been laundered through Spectrum.
What?
Which was not the case. Well, so the reason that they probably thought that is, and it's more corporate shenanigans, my favorite thing, is that when they purchased Spectrum Holobyte, it was actually a combination. They combined Gilman Louie's company, Nexa, with Spectrum Holobyte and actually created a new holding company called Sphere Inc., and the chain of reporting up through that is that Sphere Inc., when you followed further up the chain, finally fed into a Liechtenstein company that was a completely separate branch of the holdings from the main Mir Group Maxwell Communications companies. So it was very logical, since these were two different branches and this branch disappeared into Liechtenstein, notorious tax haven in Europe, it was probably logical for the investigators to think the only reason Maxwell would found this random computer game holding company in Liechtenstein is so that he could launder money through it. So it's a logical leap, but it definitely wasn't true. I mean, he may have been laundering it in Liechtenstein, but whatever shenanigans he was doing did not go all the way down to the Spectrum Holobyte level. They had no money. But that made it even harder for them to dig themselves out of this mess, because they had regulators convinced that Spectrum Holobyte either had this money or had previously had this money, and they were ready to dismember the whole thing for parts to get it back.
Wow. That must have been a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Just as everything was collapsing around them. I mean...
And of course, Wild Bill Steely, helped them out during that period by giving them a $500,000 infusion, no questions asked. But that only went so far. They needed proper funding after that, and they were able to use this hype over VR and the fact that they were moving into Super Nintendo games, which was a growth market, to get some serious investment during this time period.
Yeah. Well, and I also find it interesting that Paramount is investing in them. I mean, It's like, okay, we just bought a license from you. Now you're going to give us basically the money back or whatever. We don't know the exact numbers. But, I can also see Paramount's side of it. They want to be back in the video game business. I mean, at this point, they don't have... do they still have any portion of Sega?
No, they well, I mean... The holding company technically still exists, but they don't have what they have is basically just the holding company that used to be Sega Enterprises Incorporated. They don't have a piece of like Sega in Japan. That's
gotcha. Okay.
That's gone.
Yeah, so they're completely divested of that operation. So, I mean, for them, this is like a return back into the video game industry on some level, especially leveraging probably their most viable license for video games, which is Next Generation at this point. And of course, they're not the only ones. We've also got Prudential has pumped $11 million into Accolade, the first major venture capital investment the game maker has received to date. So,
yeah, and Accolade, one of the few companies that never goes public throughout this entire period in the 90s. They remain privately held up until they're purchased by Infogrames. And, they had never had to take money before because Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead, when they founded it, they used their stock from Activision, which had just vested from when it went public, to kind of fund the company, and then were on their way. But they were destroyed by the Sega v. Accolade case over their reverse engineering of the Genesis and the copyrighted Sega logo that showed up, or trademarked Sega logo that showed up, because they basically had to halt all development for a couple of years while they sorted that out, the legal stuff out. And this is a period of time where, as development costs are getting bigger, as games are getting more complex, you couldn't afford to sit out a couple of years. You couldn't just bounce back from that because budgets are so big, teams are so big, and so they had to turn to venture capital. They brought in, would eventually bring in Peter Harris from formerly of FAO Schwartz to induce even more venture investment. And it's just, this is a period where you had to go big or go home, and we're going to see a lot of companies over the coming episodes in 93, 94, 95 and beyond, where companies are either going big or going home, or in some cases very spectacularly doing both at the same time.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that Accolade's efforts on console, their whole ballistic line of games, pretty much all sucked.
Yeah.
They don't really have a good software title for consoles, and their PC output has been dwindling, if not just outright suffering, for years. I mean, their leap Test Drive doesn't really make a good leap off of 8-bit, especially Test Drive 3, which is just bad. And so forth. I mean, they don't have a lot of properties to build off. They need some money, and unfortunately, it's not really going to go into good games. But, oh well. And one last note here on finances and traditional computer game companies trying to make transitions. Ocean is also feeling the need to go big or go home, but on a smaller scale, signing a £1 million deal with Digital Image Design, the company that made their RoboCop 3 and Epic games. They are stubbornly sticking with the Amiga as an included platform, though, albeit AGA systems. And
yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned them doing it on a smaller scale, and I mean, this is really, this contrast here is you're really starting to see the end of the British publisher, because in the U.S. you had a lot of venture capitalists eager to go in, so you see these rounds of funding at places like Spectrum and Accolade. In France, there's a sudden run in the bourse, the stock market, where they have essentially their own version of the dot-com bubble in the mid-90s, except instead of being dot-coms, it's computer games. And that's why you suddenly see companies like Infogrames and Ubisoft and Titus Interactive and Vivendi owning half of the computer game industry, is because investors in their stock market suddenly got super excited. Whereas in Britain, there's really no venture capital to speak of, and the stock market doesn't care one fig about video games. And so the British get squeezed out because all of these other countries around them, there's investment money pouring in, and the British companies can't get that same level of investment money, which is why their kind of expansion here is so paltry in terms of dollar figures compared to what we're seeing in these other places.
Yeah, and I mean, they're still betting. I mean, Digital Image Design is working on 2 titles, Inferno and Odyssey. Inferno is basically just a follow-up to Epic. It's another space shooter. And Odyssey is supposed to essentially be an updated version of Elite. So they're basically doing Wing Commander and Privateer. But they're using a 3D engine that's way behind the times. It's still got to run on an AGA Amiga, which, no. Inferno will be released. No Amiga version, but the DOS version will come out. Not great reviews. And that's pretty much going to be the end of that. Now, DID is going to stick around in the industry for quite a while and release a whole bunch of other flight sim products. But it's, Ocean is stubbornly not going pure console, not changing their game design philosophies to upgrade. They're still, we've got a license, we make a movie based on a game based on a movie, and the window for selling it is at most 3 weeks. Then it has to be replaced, and so we don't invest a lot in game design, and that's going to kick them out of the U.S. market, as anybody who's ever played their Dennis the Menace game will tell you.
And makes them, ripe for a takeover from good old Infogrames.
Exactly. So sad.
Absolutely. And with that, we will end this episode on one final note here. Chef's Game Over gets reviewed.
The inside look at Nintendo, with its original, quite provocative title, has been reviewed by coin-op trade mag Replay. The magazine recommends the book for those that want to understand the history of the industry and its most powerful player.
And, let me tell you, for the most part, it still holds up. Yeah, it's got some errors, but there has never been as deep a look. I mean, it is such a case study in how Nintendo of America especially came to be as dominant as it was. It's really a brilliant business story. It's a riveting case history. If you're into business history, even if you're not into video games at all, just as a business history, it's an incredible book. It is still mostly accurate. I mean, even as we know more today, it's still mostly there. And I would join Replay of 30 years ago and continue to recommend it to this day to understand the history of the industry and its most powerful player.
Exactly. I mean, I've got my copy. It's a later edition. But I got a copy here behind me. I mean, I wish I had the copy that had the old title, How Nintendo Zapped an American Industry, Captured Your Dollars, and Enslaved Your Children.
Yeah, and it was a clickbait. It was a classic clickbait headline because the book itself isn't that negative on Nintendo. It doesn't really go into the whole video games are bad stuff. Like, it doesn't take that editorial opinion. It talks about some of the people who complain about video games being bad, but it's not a Japan basher. I mean, this is the height of Japan bashing when this book comes out, because it's the height of the trade imbalance between Japan and the United States right before the whole bubble economy collapses. During this period when people in the United States were really deathly afraid that Japan was going to overtake the U.S. as the number one economy in the world. And it could have been another one of those Japan bashers, and it really wasn't, despite the title.
Well, and that's the thing. It feels like one of those moments where somebody forced that title on him, or somebody in marketing thought of it, because, the book does not read that way at all. Now, there are a few moments when, especially Howard Lincoln comes off as sinister as all. I mean, when he's talking about, the Atari lawsuits, and he's like, they lost, they had 90% of the market and then they lost it. I'd love to see them. And he's describing it as, his secretary brings him the Japanese tea that he just sips. It's like he's being described like a Bond villain at that point.
Well, I mean, this is
probably accurate, but still.
But I mean, this is the guy. This isn't a Game Over anecdote because it happened after the Game Over was published. But this is the guy that sent a letter to Tom Kalinske saying, "Roses are red, violets are blue. You had a bad day. A boo hoo hoo." After the Senate hearings that we'll be covering in December 1993.
That's true. That is true. I'm still looking forward to those Senate hearings. That's going to be messed up on so many levels. Okay. That concludes our discussion. We only have one thing left. Alex, what is the word of the episode?
The word of the episode definitely has to be go big or go home. Because we're seeing that everywhere, whether it's AMD trying to up the manufacturing of 486s, Microsoft trying to put Windows on everything, or classic computer game companies like Accolade and Spectrum Holobyte trying to expand with new infusions of capital. This is the height of the Sillywood period. This is right before the dot-com boom begins. This is a time of go big or go home.
So very, very true. Okay, well, remind everybody where they can find your fine work.
As always, it is all unified under the banner of They Create Worlds and at the website theycreateworlds.com. There are links to the podcast there, which can also be found directly at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms, such as iTunes, Spotify, etc. There's also, of course, the book, which one of these days will have a sequel. They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, which is available direct from the publisher CRC Press or at major online retailers.
Excellent. And remember, everybody, you can support the show by clicking on the link, going to Patreon, and getting all that wonderful bonus content, as well as early access to our interview episodes. And if you do have any questions, comments, suggestions, hints, tips, whatever, send them to me. I read all the messages that we get, and even respond to most of them. Unless, of course, well, you're that Nigerian prince who just will not take no for an answer. So, okay, everybody. as always, have fun, and we'll see you back here next time. Bye.